Welcome, everybody. I'm Valerie Camus, and I'm happy to welcome today Dr. Gabora. She is full professor in the University of British Columbia in Canada, and she's working on mechanism underlying creativity. She is working in an interdisciplinary field that has huge impact on different psychology fields in psychology, art, music, and even in business. We are so pleased to welcome her today and to listen to her today. Thank you so much, Liane, to join her today.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I'm so honored to be speaking at the One World seminar. And the research that I'm going to share with you today, it grew around three of what I think are the most fascinating questions in science. The first is, we know that culture exhibits cumulative adaptive change over time. Ideas build on one another and they change and they become more adapted to our needs and to our interests. But can we develop a formal framework to describe its evolution? And the second one is, how do the creative processes that fuel cultural change actually work? And the third one is, how did we acquire the capacity for cumulative creativity? And these three questions are very interrelated in the sense that any progress that you make on one of them informs the other two. And so what I'm going to share with you today is some of the research that my students and I've done towards tackling these three big questions. And just as some context, how I got interested in these questions and how I came to realize that they're all very tightly intertwined is when I was a graduate student, I developed a computer model of cultural evolution. It actually was the first computer model of cultural evolution. There was a model of cultural transmission where you just have two possibilities for one trait and you see whether it converges on one or the other. But the first computer model that exhibited actually cumulative, adaptive, open-ended change over time was this one. I developed it at the Santa Fe Institute during their summer school. And so basically, it was an artificial society of neural network-based agents. And each iteration, each agent could either invent a new idea, and these ideas were ideas for actions, or imitate what their neighbor was doing. And so you can sort of see what I got there. You can see this little graph. It's a very primitive from the 1990s, but basically it shows that you see the emergence of new ideas and you see how they spread as they get imitated over time. And I could observe the effect of manipulating variables, psychological variables, such as the capacity to mentally simulate what you're going to do before you actually do it, or varying the ratio of creating to imitating. And that's shown in the graph on the right, where I'm varying p-create means they're creating 100% of the time. P-create equals 0 means that they're inventing or they're imitating all of the time. And I could also manipulate environmental variables. So I could insert either complete or semi-permeable barriers or the effect of media. So say there's one individual and all of the agents get to watch that individual, not just their neighbors, but also this very prestigious individual. How does that affect the patterns of cultural change? And so, as you can see in the graph, the cultural fitness would increase as the agents began to execute superior actions, and the diversity would at first increase as they explored the space of possibilities, and then it would decrease as they started to converge on the best and refine them. And I got some interesting results. So this particular graph shows that when they are creating none of the time and imitating all of the time, nothing at all happens, as shown in the green line. It's just like a high school dance where they're just watching each other, waiting for something to happen. So that wasn't ideal, but it also wasn't ideal if they were inventing all of the time. Now that was better than if they're imitating all the time. But as you can see, the mean fitness of their ideas across the society as a whole was highest at some intermix in something between these two extremes. And so there were some interesting results I was getting. Now, like all models, I knew that it had to be taken with a grain of salt. Any model, you're just carving out a little piece of reality and pretending nothing else exists. But there was an even bigger problem with the agent's creative process. So I realized that I'd have to move from studying how culture evolves to studying creativity. So I started to investigate the creativity literature. And so the conventional view on creativity is that creativity shifts between a divergent form of thought where you generate multiple ideas, and this is tested using divergent thinking tests such as the unusual uses test, where you're asked to think of as many ideas as you can for some common object, such as a brick. And then in convergent thought, you select one idea and refine it. So divergent thought is pretty useful for if you're stuck in a rut and you have to get out of it. And then convergent thought is more useful because you have mental energy left over. You're not making all these diverse associations. You have mental energy left over for operations, mental operations. And this really didn't ring true to me, and nor was it consistent with many of the first-hand accounts that are in the literature, and also with the accounts that I was getting, because as a creativity professor at UBC, I was getting a lot of people knocking on my door and talking to me about their creative process. And so it seemed to me that sometimes creators generate multiple options and then choose the best. But more often, they're generating a single possibility. They have a task in mind, and they are just using strategy and intuition, followed by reiterated refinement, or what I've called honing, of the idea. And so I viewed creativity as the ability to dive deep with a promising idea, as opposed to the ability to generate many ideas. So that leads me to the first principle or tenet of the theory of creativity that I've been developing, that is referred to as honing theory. And that's that we hone ideas by reiteratively viewing them from different perspectives, something I've referred to as context-driven actualization of potential. So now I'll just delve into that in more detail. I'll start off by talking a little bit about conventional theories of creativity. So as I said, there's the Guilford's divergent, convergent theory, the idea that we generate divergent ideas involves generating many options, and then you converge on them. And then there's Finkward and Smith's generate and explore idea theory, and it's similar in many ways. It took on, like all subsequent theories, some aspects of the divergent convergent view, but the idea here is that you have a generation phase followed by just an exploration phase, and that just repeats until you are happy with your idea. And then there is the blind variation and selective retention theory, where you just blindly generate many different possible variants. So this theory was inspired by how natural selection works, which is obviously a mechanism for generating change. So it was a sensible thing to try. You blindly generate them, you select the best, you blindly generate more, you select the best, and so on and so forth. And the theory that I've been working on suggests that instead of this, you have reiterated processing in which the output of each mental operation suggests a new context, a new perspective, a new way of looking at it. And that catalyzes the next mental operation, and so on and so forth, until your uncertainty about it has reached an acceptable level, and it feels finished. And so in this little animation, the transition from having a ill-defined idea where it's sort of vague and blobby, and then you apply context, and that's represented by like looking at that little line, and so on and so forth. And once again, it's divergent in the sense not of multiple ideas, but in the sense of looking at the idea in unconventional contexts. And as you proceed, you look at it in increasingly conventional contexts. So it's a different way of understanding what divergent might possibly mean, or how it might apply to creativity. But then to understand how the mind deals with the idea or the task by looking at it from the different contexts, you have to understand that you have to be able to describe the interaction between your conception of the task and a context. And it seemed to me that creativity is very vast in what it could mean. You get creators, artists talking about their muse and so on and so forth. But if you can boil it down to a little mathematical model of either how two things combine that haven't combined before, or how you see one thing in a new context, that would be a way of wrapping your hands around this big, seemingly endless topic. And the implications of this little formal model would tell you something about all of these vast processes that we call creative. But it turns out that to understand how concepts or any other kind of mental units interact is really difficult. So concepts interact in all kinds of non-compositional ways. So, for example, people will give talks as a trait of pet bird, but they won't give it as a trait of pet or as a trait of bird. And people will never give guppy as an instance or exemplar of either pet or of fish, but they will give it as an instance of pet fish. So what is going on? How can you describe how concepts interact when you've got things that are emerging in the interaction that are not present in either of the two constituents? And long story short, this led me to a quantum approach to concepts. So I had, by just pure chance, I had come across a paper in which Didrik Arts and Sven Arts had described problem solving using the mathematics from quantum mechanics. And it seemed to me that this would also be useful in describing conceptual interactions. And by the way, every other mathematical approach had been tried and failed to really describe. They could do a really good job of modeling what happens when you're trying to categorize something as an instance of one concept or another. But they did a really poor job of describing what happens when concepts interact with each other when you're being creative. And so it seemed to me that this quantum approach might be useful for modeling how concepts interact. So non-compositional interactions might be able to be described in terms of entanglement and interference effects. So entanglement is when two things come together and anything you do to one affects the other, even if it's far away, and interference or effects are when these two things are interacting in ways that are not composite, nonlinear ways. And there's also something like an observer effect for concepts, in the sense that when you're not thinking about a concept, it could potentially have any property, or any exemplar could be an instance of that concept. But then it's almost in the context that you look at it that some of these properties and exemplars kind of collapse into place or snap into existence, and other ones become irrelevant. And one example that I like to use in the classroom is the example of kitchen island, because if ever there was a defining feature of a concept, it's surrounded by water for an island. But in fact, we very happily use the phrase kitchen island to refer to something that, if it's surrounded by water, you're in deep trouble, right? So in this view, the context acts as a measurement, and it induces a collapse to a state of that concept, which is modeled as a projection into a different subspace. And this quantum approach to concept interactions is still unproven, it's still tentative, but there is extensive theoretical development and empirical support. And now there's actually, in the last 2 decades since this first paper that my supervisor and I wrote, which is featured at the top there, there's been an annual conference and many dozens, probably hundreds of papers, and I think 3 special issues, several books, and so forth. So the basic idea then is that, say you have the concept of a house, and that's represented by this vector P, and then, you know, in the default context, which is in red, it collapses to the projection vector W, and this is your typical default house, which is not edible. And so it doesn't have the property of being edible. And that's shown by the fact that subspace A1 is greater than subspace 0. But if you see Kaus in the context gingerbread, as shown in blue, which is represented by P sub E, it collapses to the orthogonal projection vector U sub B, a gingerbread house. And now it does have the property of being edible, and that's shown by the fact that B sub B0 is less than B1. And so that just gives you the flavor of how this approach to concepts works. And that brings us to the second principle that I want to share with you, and that's that thoughts and ideas are knowable by way of the projections that they cast into awareness. So if you think about different sketches for a painting or different prototypes for an invention, in something like in the other theories of creativity that I spoke with you about recently, they're modeled as different entities that exist in different places. And so the ideas that underlie them are also treated as different entities. And since this is true in the real world that we exist in and function in, it seems natural to assume that it's also true of the ideas for these things. But this quantum approach suggests that the different sketches are actually consecutive projections of the same underlying mental construct. So you've got something in your mind, it's ill-defined, so you paint a sketch of it, and then that feeds back on it, alters your conception of it. And then you do another sketch for what it might look like. And then that once again alters your conception. But it's really this conception that's changing. There's different sketches, but the underlying representation is actually the same entity. And it's changing over time as these different contexts are applied. And this is kind of reminiscent of Plato's allegory of the cave, where you can't know exactly what's casting a shadow. You only know it by way of those shadows it's casting. And so a metaphor for explaining how this relates to divergent and convergent thought is the following. Now, this is a figure that you might recognize. It's from a book by Douglas Hofstadter called Gödelischer Bach. And it shows two ambiguous wood cuttings with light shining from three directions, yielding three different shadows, a G, an E, and a B. So the top triplet, as he calls them, it's a pun on triple and letter, it's not just a rotated version of the one below it. It's actually a completely different shape, even though they yield the same three shadows. So now what I want you to do is imagine these wood cuttings are hidden, and we had to understand their shape by the shadows that they cast. And to me, this is very similar to the situation that you're in when you're trying to understand a creative idea and make sense out of it. So what you are doing is to understand what shapes they are, you would have to shine light from a bunch of different angles. And since the upper and lower wood cuttings actually have different shapes, then to distinguish them requires that light be shown from more angles, casting shadows that don't even look like actual letters. And similarly, we may know ideas by the residues that they leave when we reflect on them from different perspectives. So the more complex the wood cutting, the more angles you would need. And similarly, the more complex your idea, the more honing steps you would need. And so does anybody know of a shape that actually leaves the same kind of shadow no matter what direction the light is shown on it from? I don't have access to the chat right now, but some people out there probably realize that a sphere is actually the only shape that we have that will cast this, the same shadow when the light is projected from any angle. And to me, that's like the kind of test that they use in these divergent thinking tests. They're things that that they're very simple, and you don't need to go a reiterated process of looking at them from multiple angles to figure them out. Whereas real creative ideas, you actually have to look at them from many different directions. It's almost like shining the light from many different directions to figure out the shape of the wood cutting. Okay, so how this applies to divergent and convergent thought is that in divergent thought, you're applying unconventional contexts, and that's like shining light from really different directions so that the shadows appear as completely different letters, whereas convergent thought is applying conventional context, looking at the thing in ways that aren't that different from how it's normally looked at. So in divergent thought, you might be asking yourself radically new questions like, if I were someone from an alien planet, how might I approach this problem? Whereas in convergent thought, you're thinking of things from very conventional contexts. All right, well, would my mother understand this if I explained it to her? And so that's like shining light from very similar angles, and the shadows appear as distorted versions of the same letter. So for example, just an E, but with a little wobble in it. Okay, on to the third principle, and that's that insight can be explained at the level of neural cell assemblies due to the sparse distributed content addressable architecture of memory. And to explain this, I have to explain a little bit of the architecture of memory. And so the first characteristic of memory is that it's sparse. So the number of neurons is much smaller than the number of items that can be encoded in memory. And so here you see a schematic representation of a portion of memory. So these black circles represent neurons, just very simply, schematically. And then the orange bars represent some possible feature or microfeature of a stimulus that you're looking at. In this case, it's easy to represent just the lines of a particular orientation that are responded to by a particular neuron. But here we have a stimulus that is a line of this orientation. And in this mind, there's no neuron that is tuned precisely to respond to lines of that orientation. So how does it store it in memory? Well, it can detect it and understand it and encode it easily because of the way that memory is organized. So memories are distributed. So items are spread out across cell assemblies containing many neurons, and likewise, each neuron participates in the encoding of memory of many items. So this is a schematic representation of a portion of memory. Each vertex represents a possible microfeature, and then the black rings represent microfeatures that elicit some maximal response from some neuron. And these black rings might be in slightly different locations in each person's brain, but overall, because they're distributed, we can still extrapolate the actual orientation of that line by looking, because of the neurons that actually were affected by it to some degree. And so the white circle integrates the region of memory that is activated by that current stimulus. Okay, so the third attribute of associative memory that I want to talk about is that it's content addressable. And this just means that there's a systematic relationship between the content or semantic meaning of what's getting encoded and where in memory it gets encoded. And for this reason, memories evoked by can be evoked by stimuli that are similar. If you see someone that looks like your mother, you might think of your mother. And so, for example, this first stimulus got encoded in the lower left quadrant of the memory. The one next to it's a little bit different, so it encoded in the lower right quadrant. The third one is more different still, and it got encoded in the upper right quadrant. But the first one is identical to the first, and it got encoded in the same neural quadrant because of this content addressability of memory. And notice this is very different from a conventional memory, which just stores something at a particular memory address, irregardless of the content of what it is, and then it gets retrieved irregardless of the content of what it is. And so it's a particular way that memory is organized that it makes us actually error prone because we are prone to things like catastrophic forgetting, but it's actually valuable with respect to creativity. And so I'm just going to give you an example of that and say to use the example, it's just explained more easily with a particular example in mind. So let's say you're a designer and you're asked to invent a comfortable informal chair, the kind of chair that you might feel like just flopping back on after a hard day at the office or at school. All right, so you've got chair, and it gets encoded. Features of chairs get encoded in particular neurons, say neurons A and B. And then let's say you get this assignment and you just don't know where to go with it. So you go home that night and then you have a baby, you throw a beanbag to your baby. And so the characteristics or properties of beanbags get encoded in different memory items, and say they are neurons C, D, and E. And C responds to any situation in which you have one thing conforming to the shape of another thing. And it was responded by the goal that you have of designing this comfortable chair. And so the next day when you return to work, you might make an association between the properties of chair and between or at least the properties of chair with respect to this particular assignment of a comfortable, informal chair, and the characteristics of the beanbag that you threw to the baby last night. And so you recognize that a beanbag forms to the shape of a hand, but if you made it really big, it would conform to the shape of your entire body. So this context, comfy, causes the concept chair to include C and activates beanbag, and then you get neural synchrony and binding of A, B, and C to D and E, and that's sort of a schematic illustration of the invention of the beanbag chair. And now let's look at how this how we can represent the two modes of thought, so the divergent and convergent thought. And first I'll compare the conventional view, and then I'll compare that to the honing theory view. So in both theories, the most prototypical or defining characteristics are represented in divergent thought. They're activated in divergent thought. So these green circles are neural cell assemblies activated when thinking of chair, regardless of which concept or mode of thought that you're in. And if it's a divergent mode of thought, then you're just spreading out and thinking about remote associates. So all kinds of possible things that might be activated that might potentially correspond to the properties or features of chairs. And so they're activated in a divergent mode of thought only. And now to compare that with the honing view, still once again, in convergent thought, you're only activating those more defining features of a chair, such as that it has a flat surface. But here the red circles indicate neurons that are only activated in divergent thought in a particular context. So, for example, in a child's room. And in a child's room, it might be relevant that a chair could be made out of plastic. So that might be activated. But notice that these neurons are what I've called nerds, which is sort of a pun on nerd and neuron, because they're out on the fringe. They're doing the really hard work. They're doing really the interesting stuff as far as the creativity is concerned. And so in the context of thinking about chair, in the context of a chair in a child's room, then plastic is one of these nerds. But in a different context, so for example, if you're thinking about a chair in the context of inventing a living room chair, there's going to be different neurons that are activated in a divergent mode of thought. And so that's indicated by these purple ones. So one of them might be that neurons that encode properties of tassels, because living room chairs might have tassels. Chairs in a child's room would not. And notice here that the nerds are only those neurons that are responding to the properties of that are encoded by neurons that are activated in that second context of the living room. And so I'm going to move on now to the next principle of honing theory. And I'm going through these at quite a fast pace. And I'm going to be explaining some studies and not really going into the details, but you're welcome to ask me about these details in the question period. The reason why is I really want to focus on the big picture and convey how they're all interrelated and convey the big picture of creativity that they collectively portray. So the next one is that we tailor honing to the situation by spontaneously adjusting the degree of divergence, convergence, and the abstractness of our thought. So creativity involves what I've called contextual focus, and that just means the capacity to focus or defocus attention and thereby shift between associative and analytic or divergent and convergent modes of thought. And so in a defocused attention, obscure but potentially relevant associations might come into play. And so I've used this term associative thought because I think what you're primarily doing there is making associations. So associative thought is kind of my version of divergent thought. I sometimes use the word divergent as well. And then when you focus your attention, that allows you to zero in on the most relevant properties and engage in analytic thought. And there's energy left over for controlled mental operations. And so when you're engaging in creativity, you're constantly shifting between these two modes of thought. You're tailoring your mode of thought to that precise instant in the problem that you're at, to the situation that you're facing right now. And that allows the fruits of one mode of thought to become ingredients for the other, which in turn gives you a richer worldview. And different people might be comfortable in different arenas of this spectrum. Some people might hang out at the associative end, some people might hang out at the analytic end, but creativity often involves spanning the spectrum between associative and analytic. And so I'm going to say more about this in just a minute. Right now, what I want to do is move on to the two transitions in the evolution of cumulative creativity and how they came about. So how we developed the capacity to be creative, and I'm going to talk about how we developed the capacity for contextual focus. And so for this, I had to call upon my anthropology and archaeology colleagues. And so this is a kind of a cumulative effort that's involved collaborations with anthropologists and archaeologists. So around 1.76 million years ago, you see a rapid increase in brain size. And that's shown by the difference between the cranial cavity of Homo habilis versus Homo erectus. You see a much larger cranial cavity in Homo erectus. You also see a transition from Oldowan style tools to Acheulean style tools. And mind you, tools, we've been making stone tools for now, it's past 3 million years ago, so for a really long time. But there was this transition at around 1.76 million years ago, where you go from a very primitive type tool to a more complex type of tool. And these drawings are from a paper by Stout, where he shows that to make these stone tools is quite complex. So he shows that it involves 3 separate processes: edging the tool, and then thinning it, and then shaping the whole thing. And he has actually given pieces of stone to his graduate students and found that they actually do a really poor job of making Acheulean stone tools. They're actually quite difficult to make. And it's hypothesized by many different people, including Corballis, Donald, Stout has similar ideas, and others as well, that this reflects the onset of the capacity for recursive recall and restructuring from memory, which would allow for a stream of thought. And this would then allow that your responses to situations are no longer fixed. They can be flexible. They can be sensitive to context. So this is just portrayed in this simple cartoon by the girl changing her direction in her escape. And whereas before this, it would seem that you would need a cue in the environment to voluntarily access something from memory. Now you no longer need a cue in your environment. You can access things from memory voluntarily because you can recursively recall things that happened in the past. It was also thought to be the onset of the capacity to act out events, to rehearse and refine skills, to use symbols and form concepts. Now, they no longer had language. They didn't have language yet, but they could still communicate with one another by acting things out. And so this is our most primitive form of communicating, is through acting things out. That was one of the reasons why I used actions in my computer model of cultural evolution. And they also had a very minimal creative capacity. And that's just sort of schematically and playfully shown here by the invention of this torch. All right, so once again, it's easiest to explain what's going on, what I hypothesize is going on with respect to the architecture of memory by using this specific example. So let's say that this caveman, we'll call him Og, let's say he was sitting around a campfire and he saw an ember roll out of that campfire. And so previously he thought of fire as something that's static, it stays in one place. But then he saw this burning ember roll out. And so let's say that he had the coarse-grained episodic mind of Homo habilis. So the rolling ember episode is coded in neurons A and B, and then the need to see in the dark is activated neurons D and E, and it's not possible to make any association between them because memory is so coarse-grained. And now let's look at the fine-grained mimetic mind of Homo erectus. And that's illustrated by that there's more vertices here, so more neurons. So every episode is encoded in more detail. So this memory of the rolling ember episode is encoded now in 3 neurons, A, B, and C. And C responds to enhanced visibility. Any situation where you can see better or you have the need to see better activates this particular neuron. And then this current situation of needing to see better involves enhanced visibility. You need to see in the dark, running in the dark. So that activates C along with D and E. And then that causes self-triggered recall of the memory of the ember rolling out of the fire and restructuring of this and combining it with this need to see in the dark situation to invent the idea of a torch, of moving a fire, of bringing it so that you can bring the torch with you. And so this was actually tested in a computational model of recursive recall and structure. Now, what it was tested using EVOC, which is kind of an ancestor of the burst model, computational model creativity that I've developed as a graduate student. And so once again, it's just an artificial neural network of artificial society of neural network-based agents that can either invent new actions or imitate their neighbors. And what we implemented was just the very simplest kind of recursive recall and restructuring. It's just chaining. It's just the ability, once you've got an idea, then you can actually keep adding new, and its idea for an action, you can keep adding new actions to it. So instead of just doing one action, they could do multi-part actions. And even with this simple implementation of recursive recall and restructuring, which is just the ability to chain actions together, that was sufficient to see an increase in the mean fitness of outputs over time. And it also actually enhanced the ability to learn. So the ability for the agents to detect and respond to patterns or trends. And so that does support the hypothesis that at least so just to backtrack just for a second, so it's really difficult for anthropologists and archaeologists to test their theories about what went on cognitively at a certain period back millions of years ago. So they don't have the luxury that we have as psychologists of having access to large groups of participants and running experiments in labs because they're interested in the kinds of minds that we had a long time ago. So testing hypotheses about potential cognitive mechanisms underlying cultural trends is actually a sensible way to go here. And we do have support that these cognitive mechanisms actually do give you the kinds of changes that you would expect. Chaining also increased the diversity of different outputs. So once again, you could engage in a wider variety of different actions if you did have the capacity to chain your actions together. Okay, now there was actually a second big change in cultural evolution. It's been called very controversially the Big Bang of creativity, because some anthropologists argue that if you look more broadly across the record, not just focused in Europe, but also across Africa, then it may not have happened as quickly as some anthropologists first proposed. But at any rate, around 50 to 100,000 years ago, you see a transition from using one tool for almost every task that you could engage in to sophisticated task-specific tools, where for every activity you engage in, you have a tool that is just for that particular task. And you also see a lot of other changes that would be indicative of a more creative kind of thinking. So elaborate burial sites indicative of ritualized religion, complex art, strategic hunting involving specific animals at specific sites, colonization of Australia, which would require dealing with all kinds of different environments, some evidence for restructuring of social relations. It's thought to be the beginnings of modern language, and with grammar and syntax, and thought to be the origin of oral storytelling. And so I talked to you about contextual focus, this capacity to shift between these two modes of thought. And so the hypothesis then is that this transition reflects the onset of contextual focus. And once again, we tested whether this actually makes sense, whether it's a plausible explanation for the kinds of changes we see at this time using this computational model of cultural evolution. And so we, in addition to the ability to chain actions, they had the ability to adjust their rate of conceptual change so that when the fitness of their ideas was low, when they were kind of stuck in a rut, when they weren't doing something very successfully, they would think more divergently, so they could call forth more divergent associations. But when they were actually doing pretty well, then if it's working, you don't want to change it, right? So they would think more convergently. And we saw that once again, when you introduce contextual focus, that increased the mean fitness of ideas, and it also increased the diversity of different ideas, particularly when a new fitness function was introduced, which supports the hypothesis that it plays a major role in breaking out of a rut, that divergent thought is most useful when you are just stuck and you need to think in really unconventional ways. And so just to sum up this honing theory perspective on human cognitive evolution, once again, it's at this point, it's unproven, it's just hypothesis, but we do have some support for the idea that the onset of recursive recall and restructuring 1.7 million years ago in Homo erectus provided us a way of escaping from the present to construct narratives about how past events culminated in particular outcomes and use your goal state to envision and creatively alter the future. And then the increase in the diversity and utility of artifacts in Homo sapiens in the Middle Upper Paleolithic revolution is attributed to the onset of contextual focus, which is this capacity to exquisitely tune the mode of thought that you're using to the actual situation that you're in. And I think that these transitions not only allowed you to solve immediate problems, but it also altered the cognitive architecture by joining discrete islands of connectivity into an integrated web. And so this brings us to the next principle of honing theory, that creativity fuels the cultural evolution of minds, the basic unit of a second evolutionary process. So I posit that human creativity stems from the fact that the mind is the hub of a second evolutionary process. So evolutionary processes, they start with a structure that is self-organizing and self-preserving. Just as the body heals itself when wounded, a mind is self-mending. Elements of a body of knowledge interact to solve problems, reduce dissonance, accommodate the unexpected. And when something happens that is out of character for somebody, or when you get a result in the lab that is surprising, you almost can't stop yourself from thinking about it, from wondering, why did that happen? And this seems to reflect this kind of self-organization, self-preserving aspect of our minds. They keep thinking about things when they're not actively working on something. And there's a well-known it's been known for since the 40s that incubating on a problem, so going away from it for a little while, can actually be helpful in coming up with a solution to that problem. You stop actively trying to solve it and you give the problem over to the back burners of your mind. And when you're in the shower or just going for a walk, a new perspective on it comes to you, and a new way of approaching it, a new answer comes to you. And I think the reason why incubation might be helpful is because honing unresolved material is actually the natural state of a self-organizing network such as a mind. So the creativity that drives biological evolution can be described using a random distribution, using an assumption that variants are generated randomly, because it's a breadth-first process. So you try enough possibilities and one succeeds. But the creativity that drives cultural evolution, by contrast, it's depth first. So you generate and hone as few as a single idea, but you don't do it randomly. You do it using intelligence, using strategy, using intuition. And so since the mind is self-organizing and is also self-preserving, in this primitive sense, it could be said to possess agency or selfhood. So you have soma-level selfhood, and that stems from your role as a participant in biological evolution, and cognitive-level selfhood that stems from your role as a participant in cultural evolution. And these two levels of endogenous control are sometimes even antagonistic. So a scientist might stop eating to develop a new theory. So the theory is contributing to cultural evolution, but they have to eat in order to preserve themselves as a biological soma or body. So that's supporting the biological aspect out of them. And they can be at odds. Or the artist who is just actively immersed in painting their painting, and that's because of the cultural impetus that is acting on them. But in so doing, they're ignoring their children. So they're ignoring what they need to do to live up to the expectations, to the biological impetus that's acting upon them. And our creative output then reflects the evolution of our mental models of reality, of our internal worldview. So I use worldview as sort of a version of the mind as it's seen from the inside. It's your way of seeing in the world and being in the world. And then worldviews, they replicate in a very piecemeal manner when we share knowledge and ideas through cultural evolution. And cultural evolution, how it's conventionally being approached, is in a Darwinian, with the assumption that can be analyzed in terms of Darwinian selection, operating on artifacts or ideas or memes. But the depth-first form of creativity that fuels cultural evolution makes culture replete with discontinuities, such as those due to cross-domain transfer, in which one output in one domain inspires an output in another. So just some popular examples, Tolkien's book, Lord of the Rings, inspired Led Zeppelin's song, Ramble On, and Schubert's Ave Maria was inspired by Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake. And in studies of the sort where artists are instructed to paint what a song would look like if it were a painting, participants can correctly match the outputs with their corresponding inspirational sources. And so you get these discontinuities, but evolutionary anthropologists tend to just kind of ignore them and act like they don't exist. And they have, for example, a bunch of arrowheads, and then any outliers, they have these predefined characteristics of these arrowheads, such as whether or not they have fluted edges, and then they develop nice tree branch-like lineages portraying how these arrowheads evolved over time. But what they're doing in this kind of analysis is they just regularly discard anything that has characteristics other than these predefined characteristics, has new attributes, and regards them as outliers. But the reality is that it's the outliers that launch new cultural trajectories, right? That launch cultural change. So we have to take them really seriously. And so the approach that I've developed for modeling cultural evolution uses something called autocatalytic networks. Because to explain cultural change, we must look beyond the artifacts to the associative networks that generate them. And I think it's really time to have collaboration between anthropologists and archaeologists and psychologists who can really make this change, this transition. So since creativity contributes new knowledge to cultural lineages, but individual learning, so for example, going outside and learning how to distinguish different trees or different kinds of butterflies, that's what is an instance of individual learning. Now that doesn't contribute new knowledge, right? So since creativity is different from individual learning in this sense, and it's also different from social learning in this sense, because it's actually contributing new knowledge. And so we need a kind of model that treats creativity, the instances of creativity, as distinctly different from instances of individual learning or social learning. And in autocatalytic networks, this is accomplished by a natural distinction between what is called food set items, which are ingredients for change, and food set derived items, which are products of change. And so the food set items are the things that you start with, and then the food set derived items are the things that you build up over time. And some other nice aspects of autocatalytic networks are that they readily scale up. They can detect and analyze phase transitions in complex networks that prove intractable with other approaches. And efficient algorithms exist for decomposing complex networks into simpler ones. So they have a lot of potential for analyzing things as complex as cultural lineages. But the main reason that we use autocatalytic networks is that what they're really good at is modeling emergent network formation and growth. And so their first application was to model the origin of life. And I think it's no surprise that the second arena in which they've proven to be useful is modeling the origin of a second evolutionary process, not the origin of the kinds of protocells that are at the heart of biological evolution, but modeling the origin of the kind of cognitive structures that allowed for the second evolutionary process, cultural evolution. So in a cognitive context, we just use this terminology, but it means something slightly different. So when I say reaction, I mean the restructuring of an existing concept or idea, resulting in a new one. And catalysis is when you trigger a reaction that would otherwise be very unlikely to happen. So for example, I might just decide to write a song about lasagna, but if I see some lasagna, then that makes it much more likely that I would write the song about lasagna. So in this situation, the actual lasagna was the catalyst. So a catalyst is any kind of external stimulus. It can also be an internal goal state or the recognition of an inconsistency or a problem, or even just a desire to express a certain emotion. So all of these can serve as catalysts that trigger what we're calling a reaction or restructuring. So formally, something is a RAF. It's a set of entities, and they constitute a RAF if each reactant is present in the food set or it's produced by an earlier reaction, and each ingredient in a restructuring is present, and each restructuring is possible given the ingredients present. So all of the reactions are possible given the previous set of ingredients for them. And all of the ingredients, they're either part of the original food set or they're things that were made from reactions on that original food set. And what this allows us to model is emergent network formation and growth. And so I'm going to show you an example of how we actually use autocatalytic networks to model cross-domain transfer using a study that involved something called the Lowenmensch or Lion Man figurine. Now, this figurine has a really interesting history, and if you're so if you're interested, I'd love you to go and check it out. But it's basically the oldest known uncontested example of figurative art. It's thought to be about 40,000 years old. It actually sat in someone's drawer for it was found in, I think, the 1920s or something. It sat in someone's drawer just because it was just a bunch of pieces. And then archaeologists painstakingly put all the pieces together and saw that it actually forms the shape of something that is a combination of a lion and a man. So it's been called the dawn of human imagination, because before this time, people had never there's no evidence that we combined concepts, that we could think of something that was part lion and part man. And so we had to put together these very different concepts and create a work of art that expresses that concept combination. So that's what it looks like. I've got a replica to show how big it is with respect to the human size, and that's the cave where it was found. And then my graduate student, Kirtana Ganesh, conducted a study in which she had different participants generate poetry and art and fiction and music that was inspired by the Lowenmensch. And so to model this cultural lineage, it's not obvious what the relationship between the inspirational source, the Lowenmensch, is, and the outputs that it inspired. So we must be able to delineate this relationship in order to actually describe this cultural evolution trajectory. And the relationship reflects actually a complex web of associations, which is modified during the honing process. So what Kirtana did is that despite this discontinuity at the level of conventional categories, a figurine versus a piece of music, the creators' written accounts revealed 4 through lines or threads of continuity by which the Lowenmensch was expressed in different domains. So the first through line was the concept of a lion-human hybrid. The second through line was the concept of subtracting from the whole to reveal the form from within. So making the sculpture, whoever made the sculpture had to take away pieces, and that produced the final form. And some of the musicians, they actually started out with a big chaotic symphony with many different instruments contributing, and then they just removed the instruments one by one. And they also conveyed the through line of deterioration and the through line of waiting for to be found with a story to be told. And so how we modeled this was as follows. So this is a simple explanation of how we modeled this transition using autocatalytic networks. So on the top, we see these processes, social learning indicated in black, individual learning in green, creative thought by a red dotted line, and then we have the reactants and catalysts and the products. And so first they had to, the maker of the statue had to obtain knowledge of lions and humans from their caregivers and knowledge of music. And then the was also obtained, and then knowledge of the figurine was provided in the study that we performed, so where we told them about this figurine and its history, and then that catalyzed the transformation of these 4 through lines into musical expressions of each through line. And these are shown by those 4 red rectangles. And then the final composition involved fusing and synthesizing these different 4 lines into a piece of music. And then that piece of music was actually performed for an audience. So this kind of shows the cultural trajectory or cultural lineage starting 40,000 years ago back to 2 years ago when this piece was performed. So the figurine catalyzes the restructuring of existing knowledge or reactants to music, which is the product. And what I want to point out is this approach makes critical the role of the arts in metabolizing human experience. So I think what artists and creators are doing, they're taking lived experiencing and then they're reprocessing it in forms that help us deal with and understand these experiences in new ways. So bottom line, you cannot describe this or any other creative lineage from artifacts alone. You have to look to the mind as a whole, as a basic unit of cultural evolution. The artifacts merely provides information about the cognitive states of the creators at a given moment. And we've also used this, so RAF stands for reflexively autocatalytic fused-set generated networks. So we've also used this RAF autocatalytic network approach to model cognitive mechanisms underlying different cultural transitions that I've talked about earlier. So recursive recall and restructuring allowed fragmented islands of connectivity in the mind of Homo habilis to become connected in the mind of Homo erectus, and then in Homo sapiens, contextual focus allowed for these different islands to be connected. When you're making metaphors between different domains, you're connecting these domains together, and you're altering the structure of your mind so that it becomes an integrated web. So each step facilitated the making of creative associations. And then we've also, in another paper, we've modeled in accordance with that, the phrase ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, we've also modeled the cognitive changes that a child goes through to become a creative contributor to cultural evolution. So going from an infant where you have disconnected memories to a toddler where you're starting to form associations between them to a child that has a more integrated understanding of the world. And this sort of schematically shows how you get from disconnected ideas using the RAF formalism. So once again, a RAF is something wherein each reaction is possible given the current reactants and catalysts, and each reactant or catalyst is either present in the food set or produced by an earlier reaction. So what you have here in the key, we see once again that the food set comes in 3 different forms. So you've got innate memory items, items that are learned, obtained through individual learning, and items that are obtained through social learning. And then in the panels, you see in panel D, for example, something obtained through social learning catalyzes what we call a reaction or a restructuring, and that results in a food set derived or food set generated item, and that's that black dot at the right. And then in panels F and G, you see this happening yet again. In this case, in panels F and G, it's something obtained through individual learning that catalyzes another reaction. And then in panel H, you see these. So both of the 2 things. So now in panel G, you've got 2 different things that qualify as a RAF, but in panel H, you see the beginnings of a merging or connecting between these 2 RAFs. And so you see a reaction happening in which they are connected, and that creates what is known as a co-RAF. So a co-RAF is any non-empty set of reactions, some mental operations, restructuring that is not on its own a RAF, but when combined with something else, it forms a RAF. And what you see here is that we can also describe the max RAF. Now, the max RAF is, in any given set of RAFs, the largest RAFs in that set. And so what this kind of shows is what I was talking about earlier, where you could, the RAF formalism allows you to break any complex set of interconnected entities into smaller subsets, into individual RAFs, and shows how they are all related to one another. And then both of these 2 RAFs are now the 2 yellow ones as well as the orange one are sub-RAFs of the larger purple one, which is the max RAF. So that should give you the flavor of how we've been using autocatalytic networks to describe different cultural transitions. And one of the novel predictions that arises for this cultural evolution framework for creativity is that because culture, like any evolutionary process, must balance creativity, which involves the generation of new variants, with continuity, which involves preservation of the best variants so far, right? And so because you have to balance these 2 evolution components of an evolutionary process, it isn't necessarily true that more creativity is better. And if you study creativity, people are always asking you how to be more creative. And, it might be that there are actually things at work in society that are helping us achieve a balance so that we are not necessarily as creative as we can be, we're as creative as we need to be to make for a fitness in to be the best for the society as a whole as we can. And so a hypothesis that falls out of this is that culture evolved mechanisms that balance these opposing forces. And this too was tested using EVOC, the computer model of cultural evolution. So we varied systematically the ratio of C, which was the ratio of creators to conformers. So we had 2 kinds of agents here. They could either be creators or conformers. So we varied the ratio of creators to conformers. And we also varied P, how creative the creators were. And so this shows a 3D graph on the left and a contour plot on the right, and showing the time to threshold. That doesn't matter very much. What matters really is that what's best for society is when the values are low. And so what this shows in both graphs is that what's best for society happens midway between these two extremes. So this clear ridge, especially shown in red on the right, shows that the optimal values of C and P are submaximal for most C and P settings. In other words, the more creators there are, the less creative they should be, the lower P should be, and vice versa. The more creative the creators are, the fewer of there should be. So once again, you want to balance continuity with change. And that's what you would expect given this cultural evolution framework for creativity. So another way that we tested this is by giving the agents something called self-regulation. And that was where each iteration, the agents could adjust how creative they were according to the effectiveness of their ideas. So in other words, if they are generating really fit ideas, then they just start spending more of their time generating ideas. If they're generating less fit ideas, then they spend more of their time imitating ideas. And what we saw is that over time they segregated into two groups. So what Richard Florida has called a creative class, and then that we're always creating, and then we also had imitators that were always imitating. And what's really interesting, though, is that what happens to this artificial society as a whole. So when you gave them self-regulation, the capacity to self-regulate, and they segregated into these two groups, this actually turned out to be better for society as a whole, as shown in the graph below, where with the self-regulation shown in blue is more fit ideas than with no self-regulation. And what was going on here when we actually looked at what was happening is that the ineffective creators, they weren't wasting time reinventing the wheel when they could actually be spreading proven effective ideas. So once again, this lends the more support for the idea that it could be adaptive for society to balance highly creative creators who inject novelty with highly conforming conformers who provide continuity. And it isn't necessarily that more creativity is better. All right, so last point, but there's many subpoints to it, is that since creativity is guided by the global structure of your worldview, not just a task domain or a selected variant or target, how you hone reflects the unique structure of your worldview. And that means that creative styles are recognizable, and not just within domains, but also across domains. And this was studied by a PhD student in my lab, Apuraranjan. And so the prediction of honing theory is that since creative outputs reflect not just chance or expertise, but the transformative process by which an individual resolves the potentiality of their worldview, honing theory predicts that the artist's style or voice is recognizable. And this would be both within domains and across domains. And so what she found was that when she had students in a painting class, they could significantly, above chance, guess which of their fellow students created which painting. And so, by the way, they'd been in the class together for some time, so they knew a little bit about each style, but they only had seen each other's paintings. But she found that they could also recognize which of their peers made which non-painting artwork. So that was evidence for some degree of cross-domain recognizability of creative style. But then she carried out a study involving creative writing students, and these students had they were in their fourth year, so they had kind of known each other for 4 years. And it probably isn't so surprising that they could recognize which of their peers did which wrote which written passage. But then she gave them the further instruction to create works of art. And she said that now, if you've ever written a story that you shared with the class in which there was some particular identifiable event or individual or something, like, for example, you wrote a story that you read to the class about skiing, well, then their artwork could not be an artwork of, a person skiing, for example. But she found, nevertheless, that they could not only recognize each other's written passages, but they could also recognize which of their peers had, above chance, which of their peers had done which artwork. And so this is the within domain recognizability results. I don't have time to go into the details. You can ask me later if you want, but this supports the hypothesis of within domain recognizability. And then we also got support for the hypothesis of between domain recognizability of creative style. We also carried out studies of authenticity. So since creative outputs seem more genuine than others, they could be more true to yourself as opposed to imitative. Dancers speak of authentic movement, and writers speak of this transition from the time from when the writing sounds like the writing style of all of the writers that they most enjoyed reading. And then they undergo this transition to where they find their inner voice, as they find their own recognizable writing style. Most theories of creativity do not even try to address or account for this. So since honing theory posits that creativity arises from the unique self-organizing structure of a worldview, it's consistent with the idea that authenticity is a real and recognizable construct. And so it predicts that there will be agreement amongst audience members about the extent to which creative performances are authentic. And indeed, we carried out some studies with stand-up comedians and dancers, and they did actually agree with each other and also with the performers themselves about which performances were actually authentic. Now, there was one little deviation here. The dancers felt that they could fake it, so that sometimes they felt that they could appear authentic even when they didn't feel authentic. But nevertheless, there was still agreement amongst the audience members about which dancers appeared to be authentic. And so bottom line there is that if it feels authentic to the performer, the audience likely feels it too. Another prediction that arises out of this is that creativity is less domain specific than research on outputs would lead us to believe. Now, most of the research on creativity is on the outputs of the creative process. So works of art or, generations of pieces of music or whatever. But what we looked at here is the inputs to the creative process. So what is going into it? What's inspiring it? And people rarely achieve creative greatness in multiple domains. And there's actually some evidence that creative achievement is highly domain specific. And yet other studies suggest that hobbies, having interests outside of your creative domain, actually stimulate creativity, and that there is, in fact, a creative personality type, which would suggest that it's less domain specific than you might think. And according to honing theory, the iterative process culminating in a creative work is made possible by the tendency of a self-organizing worldview to minimize inconsistency using whatever material is at its disposal. So it predicts that influences from domains other than that of the final product will impact the creative process and its outcome. And so we carried this out using two studies, one with creative experts and one with undergraduate students from diverse academic backgrounds, where the participants listed their creative outputs, and they also listed all of the influences or sources of inspiration according with each output. And some of them listed long lists of outputs. We were surprised by the number of outputs that people listed, and then they got categorized as within domain narrow, within domain broad, cross-domain, and uncategorizable. And so here's just a very tiny sample of some of the examples in each of these four categories. And just briefly, since we're nearing the end of the time, what we found is like beyond our wildest hopes for this study. So we found that the cross-domain influences were even more frequent than within domain influences. And so bottom line is, if you examine not the inputs to the creative process, or sorry, not the outputs to the creative process, but what the inputs to it, then you get support for the prediction that cross-domain influences are, that creativity is much more cross-domain than existing studies would lead you to believe. And in fact, cross-domain influences were found in this study to be ubiquitous. Okay, one more, the very last one, actually, I won't do the last two, is that half-baked ideas may contain extra material not used in the final product. So we tested this using a study of analogy. So the prevailing theory of analogy is structure mapping. That's the idea that you search items in memory until you find an appropriate source. And then you have a one-to-one mapping of correspondences from the target to the source. And that predicts that incomplete solutions are lacking in some correspondences. So there shouldn't be anything extra in an incomplete answer versus honing theory views it as not a matter of search, but before you find the solution, your mental state is a superposition of possible sources. And so here we see a schematic characterization of that, and it predicts that an incomplete solution might have extra correspondences. And so what we did was we gave people analogy problems and we saw how long it actually takes people to solve that problem. And so we gave some new participants less than that amount to solve them. And then we asked them, we interrupted them while they were trying to solve it and asked them what's going on, in your mind right now. And then we examined these incomplete solutions. And so this shows what you might expect early, late, and after the analogy problem is solved according to both structure theory and honing theory. And so the complete analogy, it looks the same in both cases, right? And so, but during the analogy making process, it looks a little bit different. Big thing is that late in the analogy process, the structure mapping predicts that you will have some of those correspondences mapped, but not all of them. And honing predicts that you will have extra correspondences that don't end up being in the final solution. So, okay, so we discarded the data from any participants that actually solved the analogy. And we only looked at the data from people who hadn't solved it. And then we asked judges to rate them as typical of honing theory or structure mapping. So does it have extra material or not? And we found, well, first of all, there was no effect on the stories in the analogy, on their comprehension of the analogy. There was no effect on whether the answer was classified as honing versus structure mapping. But more importantly, we found significantly that partial solutions were judged more often as honing than as structure mapping. And so once again, this preliminary support for the hypothesis that incompletion solutions to the problems consist of not one selected source, but multiple superposed source. So thanks for sticking with me. It's been a long talk. I'll just sort of review these principles one at a time. We hone ideas by iteratively reviewing them from different perspectives. Thoughts and ideas are knowable by way of projections they cast into awareness. Insight can be explained at the level of neural cell assemblies due to the sparse distributed content addressable architecture of memory. We tailor honing to the situation by spontaneously adjusting the degree of divergence and convergence, abstractness of thought. We talked about two transitions in the evolution of human creativity. First one, which is proposed to have been brought on by the onset of recursive recall and restructuring, and the second by the capacity to shift between modes of thought. Creativity fuels the cultural evolution of minds, which are viewed as the basic unit of a second evolutionary process. And since creativity is guided by the global structure of a worldview, not just the task domain, how you hone reflects the unique structure of your worldview, leading to a recognizable style even across domains. Creativity is less domain specific than research on outputs leads us to believe. And we in fact found that cross-domain inspirational inputs predominate. Half-baked ideas may contain extra material not used in the final product. I didn't talk about this one, but another prediction is that unlike elaboration, which it just involves adding details willy-nilly, honing can result in dimensional reduction. And in fact, this is most often in like mathematical creativity, where you show that two different theories are actually can be boiled down to one theory. And finally, that creativity can be transformative and therapeutic. If when you're being creative, you're actually adjusting, transforming the structure of your mind, it would follow that it's a transformative and therapeutic process. And there is, in fact, a lot of support for that in the literature. Now, much of this is highly tentative. A lot of the research that I've shown you was just a study that was carried out once, and it might have been even just part of an honors project. So each of these pieces of the puzzle is still very tentative. Much more testing is needed. But what I think is is promising is that we see a convergence of different levels of explanation: the neural level, the cognitive, the cultural, the biological, and the anthropological, as David Marr said, is characteristic of a promising theory. And so I would like to conclude by just thanking everybody for listening to the talk, and just noting that many students have contributed to this research program, and I pictured some of them here, and thanks to the grants that have supported my research. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liane. That was lovely. As a reminder, my name is Dawn Weatherford. I will be moderating the Q&A. You can either ask questions by typing them in the Q&A feature, or if you want to ask my question by raising my hand and doing it verbally, that also is an option. So I'll try to get everything in. We've got some good questions already in the Q&A. Along the same kind of lines as I would have asked, but they come from one of our previous speakers, Ven Popov. So his first question has to do with AI and LLMs, which you may have anticipated. So one of the big breakthroughs in AI was the addition of a mechanism known as self-attention, in which the representations of words in an input to a neural network are transformed depending on the surrounding linguistic context. This reminds me of how you framed the context-based activation of concept features in humans as a basis for creativity. Empirical data shows that LLMs can be as creative as humans, at least on the type of psychological measurements we have developed. LLMs are also much better at problem solving and reasoning when using chain of thought method, in which they are instructed to simulate recursive thinking as you described it in its input. Yet, many argue that fundamentally an LLM is an imitation machine and can never be truly creative in the same way as humans can. Here's the question. Given your framework, do you think that there is still something fundamentally missing in LLMs that is necessary for human creativity?
Yeah, that's a great and timely question for sure. And I've given several talks on AI and creativity, so I didn't talk about that at all in this particular talk. But for sure, I've been amazed by the creativity of LLMs. One of the interesting things that I asked a ChatGPT to do is to invent new words that don't mean anything, but also invent the corresponding meanings that it feels like they should have. And then explain, and I asked it to explain both at the layperson level and at a very technical level, how it actually invented these new words and their corresponding meanings. And so what it did was it actually, and I've noticed that no AI has been capable of this until about 2 years ago. And so I asked it to do it, and I wish I had it with me, but it invented some amazing words, some words that just, and it gave them meanings that really felt like they were the meanings that corresponded to those particular words. If anybody's interested, just email me and I'll send you the list of words that it invented, or you can just ask it to do it yourself. And then I asked it in detail, how did it go about inventing them? And of course, it uses, so it has self-attention in two ways. So both with respect to the inputs, what large language models, and there was a paper in 2017 called "Attention is All You Need" that just changed everything in the field of AI. And so when it got the neural network to do two things, they were still learning and processing information as they had been before this time, but not only does for each part of the input, you look at the other parts of the input and you sort of modify your understanding of that input with respect to each of these other parts, but also with respect to the desired output, you look at each part of the input and see with respect to what are the constraints and how it needs to change. And so when you are not only feeding it these different inputs, but feeding it how these different inputs look with respect to each of the other inputs, what you're actually doing is examining these different parts of the input with respect to, in the context of each of the other parts of the input. So once again, when you add this attention mechanism, what you're actually adding is the ability to take context into account. And I've used the word context probably 100 times in this talk. So that's what it was able to do. And also it had knowledge about words that tend to have certain sounds and how those certain sounds tend to be associated with certain meanings. And so it was able to produce words that had meanings that corresponded with them in the way that human generated words and their corresponding meanings actually have. And so one of the things that I've talked to Marina Wang, one of my PhD students, about is comparing the abilities of people to detect which words and their corresponding meanings were made by a large language model and which word and their corresponding meanings were made by real people. And I suspect that up until the outputs from 2 years ago, this would be absolutely simple. But starting from the last year and a half ago or so, I think it'd be really difficult to determine which words and their corresponding meanings came from real people versus the ones that were generated by large language models, because it's using our knowledge of language in a sophisticated way that combines not just the meanings, but the sounds of these words that we associate with these different meanings. Nevertheless, I mean, the question that I was asked was, do I think that they are being creative in a human way? And I think that something is creative, as I've said in this talk, to the extent that it is reorganizing or transforming a mental model of the world that extends from a self-organizing autonomous structure with agency. And large language models, despite their sophistication, they don't have agency. They were only generating these words and their meanings in response to a prompt from me. I wanted them to do that. They weren't generating them because it helped them answer questions that they had for themselves. They weren't generating them to modify an internal understanding of a world that they live in as an autonomous entity with agency. And so to me, they're not creative, because creativity is something that is done in the service of either preserving or improving or expressing a mental model of the world. And yet they might still be have reached the level where we can't distinguish them from human-made outputs.
Lovely. Great answer. Thank you so much. Ben's next question takes a little bit of a left turn in focusing on humans. So people notoriously become more conservative towards novel ideas as they age. Do you think that this is an evolved property of aging because it contributes to the balance you mentioned, the necessity to preserve the best parts of culture that come before with the generation of new ideas?
Oh, that's an interesting hypothesis. It's something I haven't explored, but it would make a lot of sense. Yeah. So as you're aging, you have less opportunities to see new things. And so you have less opportunities to make startlingly new revolutionary changes in how you understand the world. And so it makes sense that your understanding of that world would correspondingly become a little bit more devoted to preserving continuity and just sort of making smaller modifications to the ideas that you already have, as opposed to generating completely new ideas. And so, yeah, that makes sense to me.
I have a question of my own. I was really kind of fascinated by your Liane study that you described, with the artists creating new art as a property of the, Liane being the input. As I was trying to anticipate what you were going to say, I was looking at those 4 different outputs, and there was some very obvious surface features, like if they connected lion and man, that makes sense that, you know, it's a pretty continuous approach to creating something new, but based on very similar themes. Deterioration just because it's old and putting the pieces back together. But I thought the most like divergently creative, or the creative in the way that you're describing it, was that subtracting things down in order to add something new. Can you speak to whether you think that there was something kind of special about that category of creativity and how that was perhaps less represented? You know, 1 out of 4 was, I would consider, one of the more divergent kinds of approaches in terms of you can be creative, but also continuous. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah, well, we were surprised by that through line, but what we liked about it a lot was that it wasn't one that you could anticipate, right? It wasn't one that you could know unless you actually asked these people, what were you thinking about them when you created these works of art? And so that one was, as you sort of said, the strongest support for this hypothesis that in order to model cultural lineages, you actually have to look at the minds that are making them and the cognitive processes that they're going through. It's not going to be self-evident from just examination of the artifacts themselves. Some lines of continuity will be, but others absolutely will not be.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
It does. Again, I was wanting to comment that I thought it was an incredibly cool study, very interesting approach. We don't have any other questions in the chat. So if anyone is interested in raising their hand to ask a question using their own mic, they're welcome to do so. Or if they want to type some more questions in the chat, we'll welcome those. So perhaps as we wait, as we have a little time, might you consider either elaborating a little more on some of the AI work that you said that you had done with LLMs, or some of the content that you didn't get to discuss, maybe kind of in broad strokes?
Sure. Well, another kind of talk that I give is, let's see, it revolves around this question of in what sense is culture an evolutionary process? And so this idea that culture, it does exhibit cumulative, adaptive, open-ended change over time. It's cumulative in the sense that new ideas build on old ones. It's adaptive in the sense that there is some general increase in the utility or fitness or value of things over time, although that's not always the case in the arts. There's some recent evidence of that. And it's also open-ended in the sense that the space of possible new outputs is not predefined, and it actually can't be anticipated beforehand. So there's always a way of inventing something new. So cultural evolution, like biological evolution, is an evolutionary process in this basic sense. And actually, the word evolution was used before Darwin's time just to refer to this kind of cumulative, adaptive, open-ended change. And then since Darwin proposed the theory of natural selection, it kind of cornered the use of the word to refer to evolution by way of natural selection. And it was presumed that natural selection is, in fact, the only way that evolution can happen. And so some of my other talks focus more on to what extent this assumption that culture evolves through a Darwinian process, to what extent that holds up. Now, when I was first a young graduate student, when I wrote that first computational model of evolution, I just sort of went along with that. The assumption that it was a Darwinian process, since that's what the anthropologists at the time were saying. And over time, I came to have further doubts that this is actually the way to go. So if anybody's interested, I actually have some extra slides that I could show if if there aren't any other.
We did have a couple more questions that came in. Ellen Dunn is asking, is there a book about this that you would recommend as best or as the best introduction?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, because I'm actually in the process. I'm midway through writing a book that summarizes this work, and it's called Dawn of the Creative Mind, The Origin and Evolution of Innovative Ideas. And I'm also almost finished writing a novel that also explores these ideas, and the novel is called Quilandria. So hopefully in the next year or two, there will be both a fictional and a non-fictional expression of these two ideas. So in the work of fiction, it's set in a house full of graduate students all living together, and they're all studying different disciplines. And yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Sounds lovely.
Oh, and the novel is called Quilandria.
Okay. Definitely put that on my real list. Okay, so Lucia asks, what role does the idea of stability of the mental representation play in the creative process? My suggestion would be that that a moderate stability would be most favorable for creativity.
Okay, I'll assume that by stability you mean that each time you access it, it's the same representation that you're accessing. And in fact, it's been shown that our mental representations are constantly in a state of minor flux. So they're every time you access a representation, you're actually slightly altering it. So it's slightly altered both by what has happened since the last time you access that memory, and it's also altered by the context in which you are retrieving it right in the moment. But because it is more or less the same representation, there is continuity in that sense, but also slight changes, that's actually helpful for creativity. Because sometimes, let's say, the last time you thought about the word duck, you thought about it, and then you've thought about certain things since then, and those things that you've thought about in the meantime have slightly altered your whole web of associations in ways that mean that the next time you think of the word duck, it's colored, it's tinged slightly differently. There's certain properties of it that are activated to slightly different degrees. And it may be that slight change in your concept of duck is exactly what's needed for you to invent something new that involves a duck. Like, I don't know, duck foot shaped boots to walk on water with, or something like that, right? So something about the way that you retrieve duck now, the way that duck has changed since the last time you retrieved the word duck, is helping you be creative. And I think that kind of change, that susceptibility to change of our representations, is very, very beneficial for our creativity for that reason.
Do you suppose that that's somewhat different than incubation, by way of you're not necessarily getting new inputs to change the representation, just things that are blocking access to the key piece of information you need fall away, and that stabilizes the representation? Are you thinking they're same processes or somewhat distinct?
Yeah, good question. So I think that's partly why incubation is valuable. So it allows you to retrieve the word duck now that it's have these new tinges, it has these new taints. It allows you to retrieve the word duck and sort of in this modified state. But also because when you're incubating, you're just thinking more diversely. You're thinking of concepts in more unconventional contexts. You're allowing these associations to be made. And so it's both because of the fact that your representations have slightly changed over time, that when you access them in incubation, that you can make creative connections, but it also is because you're thinking more divergently.
Excellent. The questions are rolling in. So Hendrika asks, hi, thank you for this interesting presentation. How do you see emotions in the cultural model? And also, how does creativity, in your view, play a role in more biological competitiveness for individuals? Thank you again. Smiley face.
Great. Yeah, so emotions I see as something that acts as a catalyst for creative thought. So often it's the emotions that you have with certain experiences that drive, or in the RAF terminology, they catalyze creative experience or creative expression. It's often the case that a lot of creativity is driven by emotions, by things that we felt. And it's because the mind is this kind of self-organizing structure that when it reorganizes itself and by exploring and playing with ideas, it's also reorganizing our emotions and allowing us to process those emotions and to think about them in new ways, and to also find backdoor entrances for them. So it may be that you had some very traumatic experience, and then you sit down at the piano or the guitar and you start writing a song. Well, it could be that process of just the free-floating sort of thought then when you're engaged in a creative practice, it allows a sort of backdoor entrance for those emotions to actually express themselves in the context of that music. And so even if you don't write words that consciously express that traumatic experience in your piece of music, you're still venting those emotions. They're being re-expressed. And by venting them in that piece of music, you're coming to terms with them. And that's why creativity is transformative and why it can be actually therapeutic. And there was a second part to that question. I don't quite remember what it was.
Yes. So what role does creativity, in your view, play in more biological competitiveness for individuals?
I have to think about that. So we have to be competitive. So our competitiveness, I think, stems from the fact that we are participants in biological evolution, right? Biological evolution is a kind of survival of the fittest type of process. And I think our competitive instincts come largely from that. And our capacity to be creative can help us compete because, for example, if we think of new ideas and they are better than someone else's ideas, then we have the competitive edge over those other individuals, right? But in the theory of how culture evolves, there's actually more room for cooperation. It isn't just survival of just the fittest. It's more transformation of all. So in survival of the fittest, a bunch of individuals sort of die off, but the fittest ones succeed. And in the theory which I'm developing of how culture evolves, which is a whole other talk, is called self-other reorganization. It's more a matter of that. It isn't the case that some individuals survive at the expense of others, but that all of them are just changing over time. And so culture is still competitive. We see different brands of peanut butter competing with each other in the marketplace of ideas, right? So they all want us to buy their brand of peanut butter. But I think it is inherently a much more cooperative process. And that is because our worldviews are not just surviving all or none, but they are transforming over time. And they transform through our interactions. When we interact with each other, actually, maybe I'll just show another slide that conveys this. Oh, wait a second. Okay. So these slides ended up getting omitted, but yeah, so this here sort of conveys the essence of how I think culture evolves. And it shows the cooperative role that is played here. And it isn't, oh, I'm sorry, it's hard to start it. Just a second. Okay. So it isn't that culture is not partly a competitive process. It is, but it's that it happens more cooperatively, because it isn't that some of these, so these green circles represent the spheres, green spheres represent our minds or worldviews, and then the networks inside them represent our mental models of the world. And so when they go gray, it means the individual is dying off, but because they're part of biological evolution. But the worldviews themselves are evolving over time, and they're evolving in part through our interactions with one another. And that's kind of represented by these squiggly lines between each of the green spheres. And so it's sort of what I want you to sort of notice from that little animation is that when there's these interactions between individuals, their mental models of reality are altered. The structures of those networks are altered. So it isn't that some of those networks are dying off and the fittest ones are succeeding. They're all continuing on, but they're being altered or changed or transformed through their interactions with each other. Does that answer the question?
I would hope so, yes. And then we have one more question, because it does look like we're at the time. So an anonymous attendee asked, you discussed divergent thought as as use of unconventional contexts and convergent thought as use of conventional contexts. What do you think determines the choice of context, both conventional and unconventional, that may lead to successful conceptual combination and subsequent emergence?
Oh, that's a great thought. So sometimes instructions that you're given affect how convergently or divergently you think, and how unconventional or conventional the contexts are. So just the task that you're in and the instructions that you're given will affect this. Often what happens is you start out with the conventional context, and it's only at the point that those conventional contexts aren't going anywhere, or that you've run out of responses, that you start with the more unconventional contexts. But where these unconventional contexts come from with respect to significant acts of creation is an interesting question. And I think that if you are a creator in a certain discipline, then you might have looked at that discipline so thoroughly from so many different directions. You really know the lay of that land. And so what to you, what to the world would seem like an unconventional context, because you know that area so deeply, to you, it actually is a context that, okay, you acknowledge that it's unconventional, but to you, there's an inner logic to it. And so I think that the application of unconventional context is only useful when it doesn't come about through this kind of willy-nilly, let's see what this happens. But when it comes about because you've looked at something and you've thought about it and processed it so thoroughly that you actually have an intuition that this unconventional context is the right way to go for this particular problem.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your enthusiasm. That was a great talk. Again, we were over on time, so thank you so much. Brooke, I don't know if you were going to kind of give everyone a prelude to the next.
I was not, and I don't have it in front of me, so.
Okay, I just want to remind everybody then, because I just have the website open. October 3rd, 2024, we have Richard Prather from University of Maryland giving us a seminar titled Critical Approaches to Human Cognition. So hopefully we'll see you all then. Thank you so much, Liane.
Thank you,
Thanks
everyone.
for the opportunity.